And so while you might have done drills to sort of get better at doing certain actions like kicking the ball from certain places or reading the field in certain ways, the reason you even did those actions in the first place was not because the action of kicking a ball from here was valuable in the game of soccer. It was because the long-term consequences of being able to do all different types of actions was still geared towards the goal of earning more points in the soccer game. The goal of utilitarianism was the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. That was the goal. Kant says the problem about this is no one thinks about the player actually making the kick. The kick itself has no moral punch to it. And he thinks this is wrong. If I were to reword this, and Kant does in his theory, another word I can use for goals are ends. Give me a second. I said briefly in our lecture on utilitarianism that some people will say the sentence, the ends justify the means. I'm also going to write that word up here. The person who makes ends and means famous is Kant. That's where that idea comes from. I just wanted to sort of get by it very quickly in utilitarianism. But this whole idea of ends and means comes from Immanuel Kant. That being established, ends are consequences. We look at the consequences of our actions and we look at our actions themselves. Kant thinks about this like as in the context of getting ahead in society. So let's say my goal, because Kant thinks these moral theories have moved the whole place of intrinsic value to the place of goals, and he wants us to think about our intuitions about whether or not that is responsible. So he has, in his book, he has people sit and think, let's say you want to get ahead, and you have the ability to con or to steal from one person, and if you steal from this person, you can get ahead because your end goal is succeeding in society, and your means might be just stealing from this person. Your end result with your end or your consequence would be getting ahead in society, being more prosperous. The ends are sort of the consequences of whatever action you do. The ends are the goals. If you've lived under the philosophy, that the ends justify the means, that is, the goals justify however it is you get there. If that's the kind of person you were, then you would be willing to, for example, cheat in this class. If the ends justify the means, it actually matters very little how you get to the A in the class. It doesn't matter if you actually put time into studying. It doesn't matter if you have ChatGPT do the whole class for you from beginning to end, right? If the ends justify the means, then we're willing to move through life cheating over people, being con men. We're willing to move through life using ChatGPT to get through classes. All we are willing to do deeply cruel and inhumane things in order to get ahead towards whatever our goal is. Kant says this is a super unintuitive way of thinking about what it is that we are obligated to do morally, ethically. The question of what should I do, if we focus on what do we want our actions to do as a matter of consequence or ramifications, that is, if we focus on the ends of our moral behavior, then the means or the way that we get there are unimportant and will mean that we do some really gross things to one another in order to achieve our goal, achieve our ends. So if the ends are the goals, the means are the way we get there. And Kant says this is actually the level in which ethics happens. Why? Because when you isolate individual actions, you learn that the means of behavior, the way that you would ever get to these consequences or goals, the actions themselves, remember they're actions and they're the consequences of these actions. At the level of actions, Kant believes we have these things called duties. Ethics then, according to Kant, should focus on duties rather than consequences. It should focus on the means rather than the ends. This is what the word deontology means. Deont here literally means duty. The study of duties is what deontology means. Remember, I said Kant saw himself as sort of saying this curve away from duty, or this curve away from thinking about our actions as a matter of our actions. That sort of tendency he saw happening, he thought was bad. This structure was the dominant idea in Western Europe. We don't have a unit in this class on religious ethics. I actually did try to sort of incorporate that, but it is just actually the fact that different religions are have different ethical theories. There are some deontological religions, there are some consequentialist religions, there are some religions that are based in virtue ethics, which we'll talk about in our next lecture. For example, most Christian ethics is deontological, but most Jewish ethics is consequentialist. And that's a generalization because in both of those religions, there exist people of the opposite camp. And that was just sort of a can of worms I didn't want to open up. Not everyone who follows Kant's ideas and principles are Christian or are religious. I don't want to ever say that at all. But I do want to also give a lot of you, because a lot of you have mentioned your faith is deeply important to you in this class, and I want to sort of help place you where you might be. If you sort of think that actions themselves are sinful or holy in and of their own right, the action itself is, then you actually probably are somewhere here on this deontological spectrum, because you actually think we have duties and obligations because of the commandments of God or because of other reasons. Immanuel Kant says it can be any reason, but Immanuel Kant personally thought because of commandments of God himself. If you think that we have these duties of behavior, this is actually probably the kind of thinker you're closest to. In that trolley problem example, part of what I was helping you all begin to think about unintuitively is if you thought, I have a moral duty to just never kill people, even if never killing people means I end up allowing 3 people to die. If the action itself, you cared about the duty more than you cared about the consequences of that duty. You were one of my students who said, I could not justify killing one person to save 3 others because that action itself of killing people is something I'm obligated against. That is a sort of deontological statement. If you were a person who said, I'm pulling the lever because I want to save as many lives as possible, that is a consequentialist statement. So I just said a lot. I want to isolate the most important things. The real tension right now that Kant is introducing is this utilitarian movement is consequentialist, which means it thinks about actions as a matter of their consequences. Kant is saying we need to look at actions themselves. Part of why that is because we could never actually do the math or have the godlike amount of knowledge to really know the ramifications of all of our actions. It's just not something we can feasibly do. Furthermore, if we begin to think about the consequences of our actions, if we think about the ends, then we begin to justify really bad things. We begin to be willing to do things which are clearly immoral, like conning people over, or maybe even killing people. We begin to do those really cruel things because we think that helps our long-term goal.